The heaviest element humanity has ever managed to forge in a laboratory exists for less than a single millisecond. We're talking about oganesson, element 118 on the periodic table. Scientists crash calcium atoms into californium atoms to create it, and almost the instant it appears, it vanishes. Yet an obscure metaphysical framework has positioned this fleeting artificial element as the ultimate womb of existence, the container of all cosmic chaos. Today, we're dissecting a concept from a thinker named Joe Bandel, specifically a section of his work called the Oak Matrix, Dance of Opposites. Bandel attempts to stitch together hard physics, psychology, and spiritual mysticism.
Bandel published the Oak Matrix as what he calls a general unified field theory of breathing truths, rather than cold equations. His entire premise is a reaction against the traditional Western idea of dualism. For centuries, our philosophical models have treated opposites as entities in a state of perpetual war. Good versus evil, order versus chaos, spirit versus matter. Bandel argues that duality is actually a loving embrace. He asserts that opposites do not cancel each other out or fight for dominance. Instead, they mutually generate, support, and evolve each other. It is a framework of integration.
I want to challenge that immediately. The idea of opposites functioning as a dance rather than a war is not a new concept. Taoism has operated on the yin and yang principle for millennia, and Hegelian dialectics rely on a thesis and antithesis resolving into a synthesis. What makes Bandel's Anchor 1 distinct from older established philosophy?
The distinction lies in how he anchors these ancient philosophical concepts to specific mechanisms in quantum physics and chemistry. He does not just say opposites attract. He claims the foundational unit of this loving embrace is the photon itself. According to his matrix, the photon contains an outward expansive male component, which he identifies as light or source, and an inward containing female component, which he identifies as electricity. He argues that this reciprocal motion within the photon is the engine that creates all existence.
Assigning gender terms like male and female to electromagnetism feels reductive. When we look at actual physics, James Clerk Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism in the 19th century, proving they are two sides of the same coin. A photon is the gauge boson for the electromagnetic force. It exhibits wave-particle duality. Do we gain any intellectual ground by mapping human gender dynamics onto a subatomic particle?
Physicists would argue we gain nothing, and it might even obscure the math. However, Bandel is writing in the tradition of esoteric metaphysics, where gender is used as an allegory for directional energy. In Hermetic traditions, masculine denotes outward, radiating force, while feminine denotes inward, magnetic, or containing force. Bandel takes Maxwell's unification of electricity and magnetism and spiritualizes it. The photon, having no rest mass and traveling at the speed of light, becomes the perfect metaphor for the prime mover of the universe. The source expands outward, and the electricity or magnetic containment reels it in, creating a pulse. That pulse, he claims, is the heartbeat of reality.
So he takes the literal wave mechanics of a photon, the oscillating electric and magnetic fields perpendicular to each other, and transforms them into a cosmic romance. I can see the poetic appeal. The danger of quantum mysticism is that it often distorts the science to fit the spiritual narrative. Let us look at the most bizarre claim in Anchor 1. Bandel points to oganesson, element 118, and labels it the ultimate womb. He states it contains every prior element or fragment and that it represents a feminine containment holding chaos, resolving it into wholeness.
Oganesson is a fascinating subject for a metaphysical projection. According to the scientific literature, including data from the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, element 118 was first synthesized in 2002 by a joint team of Russian and American scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna. It is named after the Russian physicist Yuri Oganesyan. It sits at the very end of the seventh row of the periodic table, completing the current layout of the elements. Because it has 118 protons and 118 electrons,
In a structural sense, it does contain the cumulative atomic blueprint of every element that comes before it.
Containing the blueprint is a far cry from being a cosmic womb resolving chaos. Oganesson is inherently chaotic. The isotope they produced, Oganesson 294, undergoes alpha decay in 0.89 milliseconds. It is so heavy and unstable that its nucleus cannot hold itself together. How does Bandel justify calling a radioactive element that shatters almost instantly a symbol of wholeness and resolution?
The justification comes from theoretical chemistry and something called relativistic effects. As atoms get larger, the electrons orbiting the nucleus have to move faster to avoid falling into the massive positive charge at the center. In super heavy elements like Oganesson, the inner electrons are moving at a significant fraction of the speed of light. This causes them to gain mass due to relativity, which in turn shrinks their orbitals. According to calculations from theoretical chemists, these extreme relativistic effects cause the traditional shell structure of the atom to break down. Instead of neat, discrete rings of electrons, Oganesson is predicted to have electrons that blur together into an evenly distributed charged gas. We call it a Thomas Fermi gas.
The loss of internal structure, the boundaries between the electron shells dissolve, and the atom becomes a uniform, smeared cloud of charge.
Yes, this physical phenomenon mirrors Bandel's metaphysical claim perfectly. The periodic table is a map of multiplicity, different elements with different behaviors based on their distinct valence shells. Oganesson, being at the absolute limit, is so dense that its internal divisions collapse. It resolves the multiplicity of the electron shells into a unified, structureless whole. Bandel frames this as the ultimate feminine containment holding chaos and turning it into wholeness. The atom is so heavy that the rules of chemistry bend and it becomes a singular, unified state.
That is an elegant synthesis of chemistry and mysticism. I am skeptical of building a life philosophy around a half-life of less than a millisecond, but the metaphor holds up better than I expected. Does Bandel address the fleeting nature of Oganesson? In human terms, lasting less than a millisecond signifies failure or instability, not a loving embrace.
Bandel's work, especially in his earlier texts like Magistrate Temple, focuses on the idea that human consciousness shapes its own paradigm. From a metaphysical standpoint, the duration of an event in linear time is less important than its existence. Oganesson proves that such a massive unified state is possible in our universe, even if it is transient. In chaotic systems, moments of complete symmetry or wholeness are rare and brief. The Oak matrix uses these scientific concepts as cognitive tools for self-empowerment. Bandel wants the reader to view their internal psychological conflicts, their own internal multiplicity, as something that can be contained and resolved, just as the 118 electrons of Oganesson blur into a unified field.
This leads us to the psychological application of Anchor 1. If we accept the premise that duality is a mutual generation rather than a war, how does a person apply the photon pulse model to their daily life? It sounds profound on paper, but actionable philosophy requires ground-level mechanics.
The application requires shifting how you interact with adversity. If you view a difficult colleague or a societal pressure as an opposing force meant to destroy you, you will engage in a war of attrition. You will waste energy. The full-time pulse model asks you to view the friction as a necessary component for forward motion. The outward expansive energy, your ambitions or desires, needs the inward containing energy, boundaries, societal rules, or even personal limitations to create a functional system. Without the magnetic containment, the electric charge dissipates. Without the resistance of the road, the tire cannot grip and move the car forward. The loving embrace means accepting that the obstacle is part of the architecture of your success.
I see the utility in reframing friction. By removing the moral judgment from an opposing force, stopping the labeling of things as good or evil, you can engage with them mechanically. You observe the tension, calculate its trajectory, and use it. This strips away the emotional exhaustion that comes with feeling persecuted by life. However, I must point out a fundamental tension in Bandel's system. He uses cutting-edge artificial creations like element 118 to validate natural spiritual laws. If oganesson does not exist in nature and must be forged in a nuclear reactor, does that imply ultimate wholeness is unnatural? Does it suggest we have to force our own psychological unity through artificial means?
That is a brilliant critique. Bandel's critics in the esoteric community might argue that relying on synthetic elements proves his matrix is a product of modern industrial thought rather than ancient organic wisdom. But Bandel would likely counter that the distinction between natural and artificial is a false duality. Human beings, and by extension our laboratories and particle accelerators, are a product of nature. Therefore, everything we create is a natural expression of the universe exploring its own potential. Forging oganesson in a reactor is the universe pushing its own boundaries to see how much multiplicity it can contain before the structure collapses.
It forces us to ask whether human psychological integration is a natural default or an intentional, strenuous achievement. The synthesis of element 118 requires bombarding californium with calcium ions at tremendous speeds. It takes millions of collisions over months of experiments to yield 3 or 4 atoms of oganesson. If that is the metaphor for achieving ultimate wholeness and containing chaos, the OK Matrix is not preaching a passive, peaceful meditation. It is advocating for a high-energy, high-impact psychological collision.
Bandel's background, writing survivalist and action-oriented texts, supports that reading. He wrote a sci-fi adventure called Anarchist Night and has translated early 20th century German fantasy and horror. His interpretation of the metaphysical path is not passive. The loving embrace he speaks of is fierce. Think of the gravitational embrace that causes a star to ignite. The tension is immense. The photon pulse is generated by constant oscillation. Resolving your inner chaos requires immense conscious effort and repeated collisions with your own limitations, much like the synthesis of super heavy elements.
Let us consider the broader cultural trend of unifying physics and mysticism. Books like Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics paved the way for this kind of thinking in the 1970s. People seemed desperate to find empirical validation for their spiritual beliefs. They want the periodic table and quantum mechanics to tell them that their souls have structure and purpose. Does blending these disciplines elevate our understanding of reality, or does it degrade both the science and the philosophy by forcing a clumsy marriage?
It often results in a clumsy marriage. The physicist cringes at the misappropriation of terms like photon and relativistic effects, and the rigorous philosopher recoils at the lack of formal logic. But we have to look at the function of myth. Science provides us with data about the material world, but it struggles to provide meaning. Humans are meaning-making machines. Bandel is engaged in modern myth-making. By taking the extreme frontiers of science, the edge of the periodic table, the behavior of light, and weaving them into a narrative about love, chaos, and wholeness, he's giving his readers a way to contextualize their lives in a universe that otherwise feels cold and indifferent.
The danger lies in mistaking the map for the territory. If a reader believes that a photon literally possesses a male and female consciousness, they have lost touch with reality. If they understand it as a structural analogy for how contrasting forces interact, it becomes a powerful cognitive framework. Anchor 1 of the OK Matrix demands that we stop treating the universe as a battlefield. It asks us to view existence as an intricate, interdependent system, where even the heaviest, most chaotic burdens can be contained and transformed.
And the ultimate takeaway from the organism metaphor is that the capacity to hold everything, to contain all prior elements and all chaos, is not a permanent state. It is a fleeting moment of profound unity. We cannot expect to live in a permanent state of resolved wholeness. The atom decays, the multiplicity returns. The goal is to facilitate the pulse, to experience the synthesis, and to recognize that the decay back into chaos is just the beginning of the next cycle.
It forces an acceptance of impermanence. The heaviest element proves that absolute order is transient. Whether we are discussing the decay of subatomic particles or the daily struggle to maintain personal integrity, the effort to synthesize opposing forces remains the core human endeavor. If you found this examination of physics, mysticism, and the limits of the periodic table compelling, text the link to this episode to a friend who appreciates deep theoretical dives.